Hi, and welcome. So for those of you that are new here, my name is Ivan. And for those of you that have been here on this channel for a while, you could probably tell that the format here is a little bit different than what I normally upload. Because it's January, I figured now's a good time to reflect on everything that we've gone through in 2025, as well as give you a sneak peek in terms of some of my plans for 2026. However, before getting to all of that, there's something I need to address. And it is this monstrosity. So, again, for those of you that have been here for a while, you know that Gandalf, which is my founding male guppy, died in 2025. And so to commemorate his memory, I figured I'd bury him in a flower pot and plant some marigolds. And my intention was to find some white marigolds to plant, to represent the color white. But in the process, I learned two things. One, I don't think white marigolds actually exist. And if they do, they are very, very hard to come by. The second thing I learned is that there are two varieties of marigolds. Ones that stay like shrubs and short, and ones that just get really tall. At least much taller than the space that I allowed on the shelf that I put this plant on. And even with extensive pruning, it didn't cut it. It kept on hitting the top, and that's why it looks super mingled. But anyway, I promised I would keep you guys updated on this plant. Here it is. It's probably going to get repotted, or at least it's going to get different marigold varieties, so that way it stays rather short. But, and wait for this, I have a pretty good transition here. So just like this marigold, 2025 didn't go strictly to plan. However, we did plant the seeds that did eventually give fruit to some incredible genetics. Let me give it the good side. Okay, so in order to reflect on everything that we've gone through in 2025, it would be important to get a little refresher on some of the goals that I have or tried to maintain throughout the year. The primary one was still to stabilize a pure line of Snow White guppies. This is what I've started with, and this is what I'm still working on. And we did run into a few hiccups, but we are very, very close. The second of the three primary goals is to try to still integrate that iridescent forehead trait that I saw long ago in one of my guppies. We've ran into a few hurdles there, and so we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And then the third of the primary goals is the infusion of the finnage that we see in a guppy strain called the Red Roses. And this is interesting because there's a lot of unknowns there, and to be honest, I don't know if it's entirely possible, but that's the point, right? And it's the last of the three primary goals. Okay, so let's dig into the crosses of 2025. So here I have my entire pedigree, and I tried categorizing these into their specific crosses or phases. The first set is obviously these initial crosses between Gandalf and 4 of the original females. After which, the next phase began with the back crosses, which involved Gandalf and then 5 of his daughters that came from the initial crosses. Now, these back crosses gave birth to essentially 5 individual lines, spanning from this C4 female all the way to this C2 female. So these crosses were prior to 2025, but 2025 was when we start taking these individual lines and intercrossing them. Hence the name that I've used for this particular phase. I'm intercrossing my specific lines. And the intercrosses really span from cross 11 all the way to 18 and onward. It gets a little confusing there because then I start throwing in the red roses, but for now, this is going to be adequate. So let's hone in on these foundational intercrosses. The first being cross 11. Now, cross 11 was between a male from cross 5 and a female from cross 6. And that was very excited about this cross because this cross was going to be the first one where there was an expectation that maybe I would have a whole brood that was 100% Snow White. However, that wasn't the case. I did have a few males that just didn't make the cut to be called Snow Whites. And one particular male was really beautifully yellow. It had a good iridescent shine to him, and he had a good overlay of yellow. And if I had enough space, I would have worked with him. However, I don't. I had to let him go to another breeder, and hopefully he's doing fine. Now, moving from Cross 11, we get to Cross 12. Now, Cross 12 used a male that was a brother to the same male that I used in Cross 11. However, this male had more volume to his tail than his brother, which is interesting because they supposedly carry the Magenta gene. Now, Magenta reduces fin size, but here's a Snow White that doesn't follow that notion of a shorter Snow White tail. So this kind of hinted to me that maybe, just maybe, a heterozygous genotype of Magenta influences fin size differently. So this particular cross was going to be probing that question. Sadly, this cross never dropped any fry. So I have no results. I don't know this, but that question still remained. And I'm still questioning it. I don't have an answer to this question. Okay, now moving from 12, we get to Cross 13. And I have them on this pedigree here. What's special about this particular cross is it used a gray-based Snow White male as opposed to the typical blonde-based one. And I paired him to a female from Cross 8. The reason I used a gray-based one was because Cross 7 didn't produce a whole lot of adequate Snow White males that were blonde-based. So this was going to be the next best bet. However, I used more than one female. And I ran into an issue where I had some fish that had some red color. So I didn't hit the mark. I didn't have 100% Snow Whites. However, the math didn't check out in terms of both females carrying the genotype that would be responsible for this red color. And this is where I learned the lesson that I need to really focus on at least one female when she's giving birth. So that way the genotypes are more predictable and I could then pick subsequent breeders more confidently. Okay, so Cross 11 through 13 were the foundational intercrosses. Now we move on to Crosses 14, 15, and 17. Still technically part of the Intercross phase. However, this is where we run into the Thorn trilogy / tragedy. And so I have him on this pedigree tree, and he was used for all three of these crosses. Here's Thorn, and I crossed him into a sister, another Snow White female here, and then a back cross here. So this is where I want to note, me not doing sibling crosses is just a personal challenge of mine. However, I will make exceptions where it makes sense genetically to pursue a particular trait. Now, Thorn in this situation was the guppy that had that iridescent forehead trait that was beautiful. And this isn't like a complete anomaly. There are guppies that have this trait. It just popped up in my breeding tree. So I wanted to take advantage of that. And in order to take advantage of it, it made the most sense to me to pair him with his sister. So this was Cross 14. I also used Thorn to cross into a Snow White. So again, personal challenge is to avoid sibling crosses. So I wanted another parallel line that I could then integrate where I have Snow White genetics with the iridescent forehead. So that was Cross 15. And this is where I started running into some of the bigger issues in 2025. Cross 15 produced abnormally high rates of deformities, and I could have used a different female. The thing is, I did. I used 3 individual females, and each and every one of them was showing those same high rates of deformities. And this was telling me that Thorn probably had some deleterious genes in him. This was then further solidified when I tried a back cross. So I was doing these simultaneously. Sadly, around this time, both Thorn and this female died. So the genetics of Thorn basically dried up here. I do not have any descendants of Thorn in my entire tree. So there's an interesting lesson here that even if we have a beautiful trait, it could sometimes lead to a dead end. But that's not the end of the world, because there is plenty of other crosses that we ended up doing throughout this year that did produce some really, really incredible results. And so now we're moving from this Thorn trilogy to some of the heavy hitters of this year. And I'm really excited about these crosses. And these are crosses 16, 18, 19, and 20. So let's get into them individually. So cross 16 used a male from cross 9 paired to a Snow White female from cross 11. So I wasn't initially excited about this cross. And the reason being was that this male came from cross 9, which produced abnormal levels of males. So there's far more males than there were females. Additionally, this male carried the half-black trait. So it wasn't exactly a Snow White male, but this is all I had to work with. Now, once this cross started producing offspring, they produced some of the best form and color I've seen so far. I have the best male from this cross, and I also have the best female. So that's really, really exciting. Another thing that happened was mathematically, or at least the genotype of these fish, predicted that I should only see half-black in the females, and all of my males should be Snow White. But I got a single male that was a half-black Snow White, which was not supposed to happen. So this took me down a rabbit hole of trying to understand crossover events better. And boy, is it fascinating. So that's cross 16. And I used this particular male in another cross that has some babies. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit. This is part of the sneak peeks of the fry and the broods that have made it into the end of 2025. So moving on from cross 16, we get to cross 18. And cross 18 used a Snow White male from cross 11 and a female from cross 13. And I try to implement the lessons I learned from cross 13 into this brood, particularly isolating just the female of interest. But we didn't quite hit the mark. She still produced brood that had red pigments. And so that told me that, again, I had a female that was heterozygous for that gene, which is unfortunate. Secondly, the brood wasn't all that impressive. A good portion of them were drab, but some of them were vibrant and had that Snow White phenotype that I like. And so this then goes into the topic of polygenic traits. And that's something I try to stay away from. And I was actually quite lucky up until this point, because a monogenic trait is just present and not present. And most of the genes I'm working with are in fact monogenic. But this is kind of the first instance where I'm seeing a brood that might likely have some polygenic influence, or at least something that I could phenotypically see. And I'm going to have to deal with this a lot more moving forward. Okay, so moving on from cross 18, we get to crosses 19 and 20. Now these are exciting, specifically because these are now not part of the Intercross phase, but what I'm calling the rose fin crosses, where I'm trying to integrate the finnage from the red rose strain into my Snow Whites. And so this was the initiation of that project, where I am doing reciprocal crosses. So this is cross 19, where I have a male to a female red rose, and a female Snow White to a male red rose. And I did this so that way I had a bigger distribution of the genetics, plus to isolate potential sex-linked traits. And for the most part, the broods for both of these were quite similar. However, I did have some anomalies that again had to deal with crossover events. So cross 19, 20, and 16, they all kind of worked in tandem when I was trying to understand more of this crossover event. And I'm glad for it, because it opens up the doors to just more interesting genetics. Okay, so that covers basically all the crosses that I closed out in 2025. There are videos that started and concluded all of these crosses. So now we're moving into the sneak peek, or at least the nursery that I currently have of all the crosses that squeeze into the last bit of 2025. And these are crosses 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, and 27. So let's get into them. All right, so crosses 21 and 22. So these are still technically part of the Intercross phase. However, we're refining the lines so that way we could isolate the Snow White genetics. Cross 21 is between a female from cross 16 and a male from cross 11. So I am repeating a male here. So I want to pause here. I have named specific fish like Gandalf and Thorn, and I've held off naming all of my fish and just kept them as a label. However, the only time I gave them a dedicated name is if I've repeated them in a cross. And here's a situation where I am repeating a fish. So he needs a name. So the way that I've been naming my fish relies on particular names that I find in adventure fantasy books. And I want to stick with the color theme, right? Thorn had some red, and that's Thorn in the Aragon series where he was a red dragon. Gandalf the White makes sense. So for this male, I was thinking a character from the Wheel of Time series. However, I haven't landed on any particular one. I was thinking maybe Galad from the White Cloaks, but I haven't decided on it yet. So if you have any particular ideas within this theme, please go ahead and let me know. So moving on. So in cross 21, I'm using this female that has probably the most beautiful form I've gotten in this project so far. And I'm crossing her into a Snow White male. Now, I'm running into another problem. She is a half-black Snow White. So again, I'm not expecting broods that are purely Snow White, but this is part of the refinement and cleanup stage. Cross 22 is very similar to that regard because I'm using a Snow White male from cross 18 with another female that is half-black from cross 16. Now, this is a very special cross here, cross 22. And so let me try to explain. I have a chart that I made that is color coding all of the bloodlines that I'm using in this project. And so here I have an image and I try to line them up side by side. They are following that same structure. So at the very top here, I have 4 or 5 different rectangles representing the fish that I started with. And each rectangle is color coded, or at least assigned a color to represent these individual fish. And every time I'm starting a cross, I do the math to dilute that color. So the first set of initial crosses produced 50-50 fish, so on and so forth. Now, cross 18, if we follows this particular female, right? If we look at all of this yellow, right, this follows this female here. So this is where we get to cross 18. Now, cross 22, which is here, is represented with this cross here. And this is the only cross now that has colors from each of the founding females. So this is very, very special. Cross 26 also does, but I'll get to that cross in a little bit. So this is kind of a grand slam moment. I have a fish, or I have a brood that has blood that it shares with all of the founding members of this entire project. And that's why I started this particular cross, is because I wanted to salvage that and kind of represent this entire project in a single fish. So that's where this particular cross is coming from. And I'm really, really excited about it. And I already have brood of that cross, and they're slowly growing. Okay, so moving on from these intercrosses, we entered the next phase of the rose fin crosses. And these are crosses 23, 24, 25, and 27. So let's talk about these one at a time. So crosses 23 and 24 represent sort of a back cross to the Snow White phenotype. So this is a slow integration of the rose fins, hopefully the rose fins, to the Snow White phenotype. So this is kind of the back crosses that we did early on with Gandalf, but with the red rose hybrids. And so again, this is just slow integration. I don't expect to see the finnage right away, but I want to have a group of fish that have genetics that's shared, so that way they could hopefully compound when I start bringing in more and more of the red rose phenotype. Okay, the next part of these crosses is cross 25. So again, I want to emphasize that it's a personal challenge of mine to try to avoid sibling crosses. Now, cross 25 is a little bit of a loophole or a workaround to that end, because I started these with reciprocal crosses, so they genetically are similar, but not quite, but enough that they are F1 fish that I could then mimic a F1 to an F1 cross to produce an F2, kind of like a sibling. But technically, these are cousin crosses. And the reason I am doing this cross is because I want to really scramble the genetics. And this is a method that you could use to kind of isolate particular genes. So I have an example here. So let's start with the two fish that we started the whole red rose crosses with. And that's a Snow White and a red rose. And I'm going to assign them genetics. These aren't strictly accurate, but I'm doing this to emphasize the point I'm trying to make. So let's say we have two genes that we are interested in, and they exist on two separate fish. In this case, I'm going to use the Snow White phenotype. And in order to have that Snow White phenotype, let's say it has to be recessive. So this Snow White male has to have two of these recessive Snow White alleles to then express that Snow White phenotype. Now that red rose fish here doesn't express the Snow White phenotype. And so that automatically means that he doesn't carry those genes, at least if he comes from a pure line. I'm going to represent that with capital S's. So let's say the rose finage is a recessive trait. This rose tail guppy is expressing it, so he has two of these recessive alleles. And the Snow White doesn't, and so he doesn't carry it. Now, if we cross these fish together, there's going to be a very predictable mix of genes. So when we do a Punnett square of two particular genes, we have to do a 4x4 Punnett square. Most of the time in my videos, I show a 2x2 one, and that's really only relevant if you're considering a single gene. But in this case, we're dealing with the Snow White phenotype and the Finn phenotype. And so in order to understand all of the alleles that each particular parent can give, you kind of have to follow the sort of the mathematical FOIL method. And I talked about this in last year's video. So if it's a little confusing here, I encourage you to look that up. So let's look at this rose tail guppy here. He can give a capital S allele, and that could be paired with this lowercase r. So we could put that in one of the boxes here. And then we could look at the next alleles that he could give, which is going to be, in this case, the same thing, capital SR. So if we keep going, we basically have all the combinations that this guppy can provide. And we do the same thing now with the Snow White, but the only alleles that he could give are the lowercase s and the lowercase r. All right, so now we start the part where we have to be really careful about filling in these squares, right? And in this case, we have the S that drops down, then we have the lowercase that goes across, the uppercase R and the lowercase r. Consequently, in this particular cross, they are all going to be the same. So I'm going to quickly fill this out and represent the fact that all of these boxes are going to be the same with these arrows. This says that phenotypically, all of these offspring should look the same because their genotype is all similar. Yes, they've scrambled it amongst each other. However, they've all scrambled it in the exact same way. And that's kind of what we saw, right? If we look here, I have this picture of the guppy. We had gray-based guppies with the red tail that were mostly half-black. Again, the phenotype of this guppy is capital S, S, R, R. Now here's where the more complicated part happens and where you could actually take advantage of all of these genes that are scrambling together, is when you take these F1 offspring and cross them together, which is the intention of Cross 25. Again, we do all the combinations that we could come up with between these two alleles, or at least four. And so if we go about it, we have capital S, capital R, capital S, lowercase r, capital R, lowercase s. And then this is the same thing that happens with the other guppy. So here is where we have to be really careful about filling in the Punnett square. So in this very first box, we have two capital S's and then a capital R, capital R. So this represents a fish that is neither Snow White nor carrying any of the finnage. We keep going. Capital S, capital R, lowercase r. Again, phenotypically the same fish, and so doesn't carry any of the genes that we're interested in. Capital S, lowercase s, capital R, again, doesn't carry the phenotype. Capital S, lowercase s, capital R, lowercase r. So this entire row doesn't have any of the fish phenotypically expressing what we are after. All right, let's keep going. Okay, so now that we have all of these filled in, we could start looking at some of the fish that carry phenotypes that we're interested in. Again, Snow White and the rose fin tail, or rose fin high dorsal fin, whichever one you want to pick. So let's see which ones actually carry the rose tail or the rose finnage. And again, those are represented by two lowercase r's. So we have one here, we have one here, we have one here, and we have one here. So out of 16 different variations genotypically, we only have 4 fish that could have the finnage that we're looking at. So that's a 25% distribution. Now here's where it gets a little more complicated, because now we want to think about the Snow White phenotype. So let's look at all of the fish that have that Snow White phenotype. So we have one here. Again, this is lowercase s's only. We have one here, we have one here, and we have one here. So again, we have 4 squares that fall under that category, representing 25% distribution. However, there's only one square where both of these overlap, and this is the one that we are interested in. And this is the power of trying to do a sibling cross, or at least an F1 cross, to provide an F2. And this is exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to scramble the genetics enough where potentially I would get a combination that is exactly what I want. I want the Snow White phenotype and the red rose finnage. But it's much more complicated than these 2 genes. Again, this is just an example that I'm making up to illustrate this. The Snow White phenotype is represented by 3 different genes, at least that I know of. And the rose tail has probably got a combination of its own set of genes. So every time you add a gene, you have to square this box. For instance, if it's one gene, I'm using a Punnett square that's just a 2x2. Here, I'm using 2 genes. And so this square is a 4x4, which represents 16 different combinations. If I throw in a 3rd gene in there, now I have a combination of an 8x8 square, which is 64 different combinations. But I have more than just 3 genes. I have 4, maybe 5. So that jumps from 64 to 256 different combinations, which is a lot. So it's very unlikely, statistically speaking, to land on that one box that has all the phenotypes combined exactly like I want it. However, I will have fish that get close. They might have some of the fins that I want, but maybe phenotypically or the color doesn't exactly line up. And so I want to be able to capitalize on those fish to then again slowly integrate into the rose fin intercrosses and integrate that phenotype into my Snow White line. All right, hopefully that made a little more sense. I know it gets a little complicated, but that is the purpose of Cross 25. Alrighty, moving over to Cross 27. So this is a cross where I'm again using one of these F1 hybrids and technically doing a forward cross to a rose tail shape. Again, this is trying to come at it at different angles, on the Snow White angle, the mix angle, and then the rose tail angle. And hopefully that can concentrate the genes I want to then again start sifting it over into the Snow Whites. A little note here, I have this cross between the red roses. I've discontinued that. I don't have enough space to keep that line going. And I figured I have enough fish that I could work with, that I could free up that space and I won't be doing this cross moving forward. Okay, so the final cross of 2025 is Cross 26. And that is this one right here. And I'm very excited about this cross because I'm using that male that showed up when he shouldn't have. And I'm trying to probe whether or not an actual crossover event happened. I think it did, but we'll find out. But I do have fry that are about a month old, and the second brood was just born. So we will find out soon enough. And I'm calling this cross the XY Halfblack cross. And my hope is that if a crossover event did happen, to go on a little side quest to see if I could stack those genetics, or at least stack the half-black trait on both the X and Y chromosome. So that way I could get a male that is expressing half-black, but genotypically it is double stacked on X and Y. And I think that would be a very, very interesting side quest to go on. Okay, so that wraps up the discussion on the crosses and the fish themselves. So reflecting on 2025, there are a few other things that I've accomplished that I'm still also working on. First being the website. So this provides me a format that I could use to give data in a way that is better suited, not in a video format. And I could do a little more charts and just discussion on each particular cross. Now, I am behind on these crosses in the website because this is kind of a digital lab notebook of mine, and my priority is on the videos. However, when I do have time, I go back to the crosses in the website and try updating them. And I provide pictures like that yellow male from cross 11 and onward. And so the website is currently at cross 11, but I'm hoping to update more of those crosses in detail moving into 2026. Okay, so other plans for 2026 involve more 3D printing, as well as trying to deal with more aquaponic systems in the tanks themselves. And this is another reason why I have marigolds, because I discovered that marigolds, when they're growing aquaponically, have very, very dense roots. And I think that's really, really good in terms of saving fry. My problem right now is that I don't think my water has enough nutrients to grow the marigolds all the way to maturity. And so I'm still working out those kinks. Okay, so some of my other goals for 2026 involves finally starting the spiral breeding program. This is something I talked about last year, but I called it braided breeding. And I thought it was pretty clever because it was an iteration of the letter B. However, I got a few comments on that video that said that the method I am describing is actually called spiral breeding, and it's very common in the poultry industry. So that's why I'm calling it the spiral breeding program, or at least the spiral crosses. So there's one other thing I want to talk about, and this is the philosophy that I'm trying to hold on to, where I'm introducing genes one at a time. The project can move forward and much faster if I looked for all the particular genes and kind of tried to mix them all up in one go, or have multiple crosses and really intermingle them and start isolating and filtering out the phenotype I want. But that really makes for boring videos. I can't talk about a particular trait in depth when there's so much going on. And so that's why I'm really focusing on gene stacking one gene at a time. It makes for more interesting videos and deeper dives into the genetics of what's happening. And so that's why I'm trying to take a step back and kind of do things slowly. And hopefully that is transferred well over onto video. So yeah, if you've been with me since the beginning, this project obviously isn't leaps and bounds. It's a lot of intentional, incremental steps towards my goal. If you want to stick around to see how this project progresses, the next video is going to be focused on Cross 21. And this is going to be a single parter, no part 2. The brood is old enough that I could look at the phenotypes and do some statistical analysis and then move forward from that cross. So keep an eye out for that video. Well, that wraps up a look at 2025, and hopefully 2026 is even better. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.